it going?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, did everybody get this? Okay, so this is mostly for the people that are watching at home, but you guys can listen too. So those of you that are taking notes at home, remember I need one sheet front and back at least filled out fairly thoroughly for you to get the extra credit. And you have to include time signatures. Also remember that I'm not going to talk about the essays too much now, and that goes for everybody else here. If you follow the website has the list of what the essay topics are going to be on, and you can study from that and the questions that are posted also. In short, what's going to happen is everybody's going to get an essay sheet that has 3 essays on it. You have to pick 2 of them, and the essays are based off of videos that we watched where you take information from the video and you relate it to something in class, okay? So also on each sheet, there's no repeats. So there are some repeats from like sheet to sheet, but not exactly. So what I mean when I say repeats is from videos. So there might be, you remember the first video we watched on the brain as a whole? So there might be like, you guys might end up getting one that has about stress management, like the Navy SEALs did that thing with stress management. And then you might get one about memory loss with that Clive Waring guy. They're both from that video, but they're different topics. Well, that wouldn't be on the same sheet though, okay? So there might be 2 of them about the guy that did behavioral science and how it can lower your energy bills, the ones that we watched last week, but they're going to be on separate sheets. They won't be repeated, okay? So again, I'm not going to take too much time talking about that. You can study that mostly on your own. What I will talk about for this part is the like clicker part or the Scantron part, whatever, and that's 70 questions, all matching in groups of 10. There's no ghost options, so it's not like there's 10 answers and there's 3 answers you won't use or whatever. I have like 13 options with 3 you wouldn't use, so it's exactly 10 and 10. And there's 7 chapters that we've covered so far, so there's 10 questions per chapter, okay? So let's start with chapter 1 then a little bit. For chapter 1, basically the 2 things you need to know are research methods, or stuff about research, and then main approaches in psychology. So if you have that table, does anybody have that table on them
Do you still have mine?
at all?
Mm-hmm.
If you don't, that's okay, but you don't have to dig it out now.
Okay.
But the table, you know, where it's 4 on each side, yeah. Can I see that?
Yeah, I couldn't find
So this table, all right, if you fill that out, that would be helpful for you. Hand that back to her. Thank you, Savannah. So let's start with the table stuff, and then I'll talk about research methods afterwards. The table has 8 approaches listed on it. It's the 8 main approaches in psychology now. So you've got the psychodynamic approach, the behavioral or behaviorist approach, the cognitive approach, the humanistic approach, sociocultural, biological, biopsychosocial, and evolutionary. That's 8, right? So let's start with the psychodynamic approach. For each approach, you should know like who's the person and what's the main ideas with it. So obviously, like the test is matching, and it's literally 2 pages front and back. So the wording on the options isn't that big, right? So I'm picking kind of the main stuff you need to know for each thing. So for psychodynamic, who's the person? Let's start with that. Freud. And then what are some of the key verbs or nouns that you would need to know associated with that?
Id, ego, superego.
Okay, id, ego, superego for parts of personality. What else?
Subconscious?
Unconscious. For subconscious a little bit too, but unconscious especially. And then drives. Drives and desires. Okay, so that's the main stuff for Freud. So again, it basically assumes people are inherently selfish. They're motivated by powerful unconscious drives and desires that have to be satisfied, or the person's going to be really upset. So the next approach is the behavioral approach, or behaviorist, or behaviorism. Those are mentioned kind of interchangeably. In the behavioral approach, that says don't worry about the unconscious, don't worry about thought processes, don't worry about memory, any of that. You should focus on stimulus in the environment, right? So behaviorists say behaviorists say that people don't have free will, but they're simply responding to stimulus in their environment. So who are the three main people we talked about with that?
Skinner
Skinner is operant conditioning and behaviorism. Yep.
and Pavlov, right?
Pavlov came up with classical conditioning. And then the guy that came up with conditioned emotion responses. Who's that guy? He had Little Albert and the White Rat.
Watson.
Yep, John Watson. So he basically proved that emotions can be conditioned, in essence, okay? So the hardcore behaviorists, if you remember, say that people don't have free will. They're just responding to stimulus in their environment. So lastly, or not lastly, but next, the humanistic approach emerged as a response to those first two. So humanism was developed by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. It says people are inherently good, which counters the belief of the psychodynamic approach, right? And they also believe that people have free will, which counters the behavioral approach. So people will kind of logically strive to reach their full potential. Okay, the next one we'll talk about is the cognitive approach. The cognitive approach basically says you gotta look at perception, memory, logic, and reasoning to try to figure out why people behave and think the way they do. And Jean Piaget is the main theorist with that. We haven't talked about him too much. I think it's briefly mentioned, but Piaget is the main guy.
How do you spell that?
Piaget. Piaget? No. Maslow and Rogers are humanistic. Well, they might be included in there, but if you remember, the matching section is not just the name, it's also the idea. So, if you remember the idea but forget the name, you still get the question right. Okay. All right, so that leads us to the socio-cultural approach. That approach is also called social psychology. That's a synonym for it. You know how for psychodynamic I'll say Freudian, so socio-cultural I'll say social psych. It's the same thing. So what does that one assume?
This isn't the social context and environment cues.
Yeah, so the thing that it assumes is that what matters is group pressure, peer pressure, group dynamics that influence how people think and act and behave. The next one is the biological approach. The biological approach is going to focus on neurons, action potentials, brain structure, anatomy, stuff like that to see how people act. So here's the thing that a lot of people mixed up on this logically. So if you guys remember these, right? So I've been grading those kind of gradually. A lot of people for part 3 mixed up the biological and the evolutionary approaches. So what's the difference between those two approaches? What's the different emphasis? Like, people that talk about evolution, do they talk about biology?
Well, one is over time.
Yeah, one is over time and one more is present focused, exactly. So if you talk about like genetic conditions that humans share that are passed on through genetics, like genetic is kind of key word here, that's going to be evolutionary. If it's not as focused on heredity and genetics, then it's going to be biological. And then the last one, biopsychosocial, basically tries to merge approaches. Okay, so let's talk about the other part of chapter 1, which is research methods. Let me give you a scenario and then I'm going to have you identify some terms related to the scenario to understand it. Let's say that we did an experiment in school and I decided to give everybody ice cream every day. Like, not everybody, I should say. Like, randomly select students. Half of the students get ice cream, the other half don't. And then I want to see after a week how that affects their grades, and how it affects their mood, right? In that scenario, what's the experimental group?
People
The one who got ice cream.
People that get ice cream. What's the control group?
The people who don't.
The people that don't get ice cream. What's the independent variable?
How they doing ice cream?
Ice cream. Yeah, the independent variable is the variable that you control as a researcher. The dependent variable is the thing that potentially could change because of being exposed to the independent variable. So the independent variable would be the ice cream. Mood and grades would be the dependent variables, right? So now let's talk about correlation as it relates to that. So let's say at the end of the experiment, we find out that mood improved for the people that got the ice cream, but the people that didn't get the ice cream, it decreased because they were mad because they didn't get the ice cream, right? So I've added ice cream and their mood goes up. What type of correlation is that?
Positive.
Positive.
What if I add something and mood goes down? What type of correlation is that?
Negative.
Negative. What if both go down?
Positive.
Positive because they both went the same direction, right? Okay, so that's research methods in a nutshell. Let's go to chapter 2. Chapter 2 talks about the brain and nervous system. So let's just start broadly and then get more specific. What are the two divisions of the nervous system?
Central and peripheral.
Central and peripheral. What makes up the central nervous system? What two parts?
Brain and spinal cord.
Brain and spinal cord. How about the peripheral nervous system? What makes that up? Makes up the peripheral nervous system. Autonomic is one branch. What's the other one?
Somatic.
Somatic is the other. Okay, so somatic can be divided into afferent, efferent, and interneurons. Autonomic is divided into two branches also. One branch of the autonomic nervous system speeds stuff up, gets you ready for fight or flight. The other one is the rest and recover branch. What's the fight or flight branch called? Sympathetic. What's the rest and recover branch called?
Parasympathetic.
Parasympathetic. Yep. Okay, now, regardless of whether you're in the peripheral nervous system or the central nervous system, what's the basic cell that composes the nervous system called? Neurons, correct? What are support cells in the nervous system called?
Glial.
What?
Glial cells?
Glial cells, yeah. Now, let's go within neurons itself. What's the other name for the cell body?
Soma.
The soma. Soma. And then extending out from the soma, there's a long band of fibers that functions as like a message, traveling the message along the cell itself. What's that called?
Those are the dendrites.
No, those go between cells, connect cells. But
The axon?
Terminals.
axon. Yep, axon. So then as you get smarter, you learn stuff. The dendrites are the things that grow. But the cells don't actually touch. There's a gap between the cells. What's that gap called?
Synapse.
Synapse or the synapse. Good. So then, since the cells don't touch, how do the cells send messages from one cell to another? Is it like an electrical impulse? Is it ions? What sends the messages from one cell?
Ions. Right?
Yeah, receptor sites, but what's the thing that goes into the receptor site to send the message?
Neurotransmitter.
Neurotransmitters, yeah, which are chemicals that send the messages. Okay, let's talk about parts of the brain specifically. One way to divide the brain into sections is you have what's called the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain is often divided into hemispheres. The forebrain basically is the cerebrum, and the outer layer of the cerebrum, if you remember, is called the cerebral cortex. So you have two hemispheres. What's the part that connects the two hemispheres called?
Corpus callosum.
Corpus callosum. And then even within the hemispheres, you can divide it into lobes of the hemisphere, 4 different chunks. What are the 4 lobes called? If you look at me here, I'll give you the first one. What's this one called?
Frontal.
Frontal. How about here?
Parietal.
Parietal. Yeah. How about here?
Temporal.
Temporal, and then
Occipital.
occipital. Okay, what's the main stuff that goes on in the frontal lobe? Decision making, logic, reasoning, problem solving. The occipital lobe then deals with what?
Seeing.
Visual, yeah, visual stimulus, seeing, visual memories. The temporal lobe has to do with language recognition. You remember there's Broca's area that has to do with speech production, and then Wernicke's area, which deals with recognition of speech. And then the parietal lobe has to do with body sensation, body control to some degree, but mostly it's sensations. So now, what's the part of the brain? It'd be back here, like not part of the forebrain, but part of the hindbrain in the back. It deals with movement, balance, coordination.
Cerebellum.
Cerebellum. Yep. Not the cerebrum. The cerebrum is basically the forebrain, right? Cerebellum's back here. Now, inside the brain, there's a system called the limbic system, which has a variety of parts to it. A lot of them you labeled on your brain book. So if you have your brain book still and you kind of quickly look through that, that'll get you a lot of the parts and like what you need to know. But again, there's only 10 questions for all of chapter 2. So I think there's like 3-4 brain parts, and then 2 or 3 questions about the nervous system, and 2 or 3 questions about the cell. Okay. A question I get often is there like a picture of the brain where you have to label stuff? Not on this one. On the final there is, but not on this test. Okay? So it'll say like where it's located and then what it does. And then you have to match it to the name. So that leads us to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is on sensation and perception. So what's the difference between those two things? Let's start with that. What's the just the receiving of stimulus from the environment? Sensation. And then putting it together to create meaning is perception. So I think in one of the videos I showed it did the classic image of a duck or a bunny.
Oh yeah.
Remember? Mm-hmm. It kind of looked like a bee. I don't even want to draw it because I'll draw something that looks really stupid and wouldn't make sense. But you guys remember that? The duck or the bunny? And then you two are seeing the same thing, right? Like you're sensing the same thing, but you say it's a duck and you say it's a bunny. The example that we brought up in one of the classes was the viral dress, like the black and blue one or the gold and white one. You guys remember that a couple years ago? There's this big debate about what color it was. Everybody's sensing the same thing. People perceive it differently. Okay? So perception is how you construct meaning out of the senses you experience. In the chapter, it talked about depth cues. So you have cues that only need one eye, and then you also have cues that need 2 eyes. What are the depth cues that only require one eye called? Monocular. Mono is 1, right? So what's the 2 eye cue? Binocular. Yep. We also talked about other perceptual cues, such as figure ground perception. Who remembers what that is?
It's like the FedEx thing.
Yeah.
FedEx thing, yep. So it's the tendency to perceive things as sticking in front of a background. There are some other ones like proximity and similarity. So if you see, like, you guys are, I think the example I used in the previous review session was Connect 4. You ever play that game? Where you drop the little pegs into the thing, you gotta get 4 in a row. Mm-hmm. So let's say I had it all filled with red ones, right? So you'd see it as just a collection of red things, like a square basically with red dots in it. But let's say that you decided to do like one down the middle that was all black and everything else is red, right? You tend to see it as red, red, black in the middle, right? You group the things together that are similar. So that's called similarity. Proximity is you group things together that are close together. Another one that we talked about was closure. What's closure?
If you like see well, not a full circle, you want to like circle it, you want to finish it.
Yeah, it's the tendency to want to
Dotted line
complete
thing.
patterns that are not complete. See it as all together. So be aware of some of those perceptual cues. Okay, let's go to chapter 4. Chapter 4 had to do with consciousness. So let's define consciousness first. Consciousness is the state of being awake, aware, and normal in your thinking and mental processes. So one of the ways that we studied consciousness was by looking at altered states of consciousness. The first one that we talked about was sleep. What are the two other altered states of consciousness that we talked about? One starts with an H and one, I think I misspoke and said that I was going to give you some of these in class. Okay, so drugs and hypnosis, right? I actually did that twice. I did it in period 3 and I did it in period 7. I didn't do it in period 6. Okay, so hypnosis is an altered state of consciousness where somebody is more focused in their attention, more relaxed, and more open to suggestion. Now, sleep is divided into stages. Under the new model, how many total stages of sleep are there?
Is it 4?
4. What's the last stage called? REM. What does REM stand for?
Rapid eye movement.
Rapid eye movement. Now, what are the other stages labeled? Do you remember? Yeah, N1. N for not REM. So N1, N2, N3. So N1 is where you're lightly falling asleep. That's where, let's say, you're laying in bed and you're watching TV or whatever. You're kind of doing the head bobs, and then your body kind of twitches. If you remember, that's called a hypnic jerk. Sometimes you might have like little, they call them hypnagogic images, so it's a kind of like a mini hallucination where you're like half falling asleep and you see something. And then your brainwaves slow down, but they're still pretty close to being awake, right? N2, you start to get bigger brainwaves, and it's kind of random. It goes between like being awake and then being more asleep. N3 is the deepest stage of sleep. In that stage, it's where people are the most deeply asleep. That's the stage in which night terrors occur. And that's also the stage in which most of the physical recovery occurs, where different hormones are released in a larger amount. And then REM sleep is known for what occurring mostly in it? Dreaming. So now, in dreaming, there's a couple different theories about why dreaming happens. One theory basically says that it's the brain trying to make sense of what happens in the dreaming. Another one says that it's a way to solve problems. Another one says that it's a way to consolidate memories. Regardless of which one of those you're looking at, all of them will look at what's called manifest content in dreaming and latent content in dreaming. What's manifest content?
Manifest is like what goes on in it, right? So it's like if there's a monster or something.
It's the actual monster.
Yeah.
Yep. So manifest is the actual content of a dream, whereas latent is the meaning. So let's say I have a dream that I'm like swimming in a giant cup of coffee, and it's like super hot, and I just feel like really like afraid, and I feel like I'm like gonna drown in this like real hot cup of coffee. Okay, the coffee itself would be the manifest content. The latent content could be that I feel like I can't handle the heat and the pressure of all the stuff I have to do, and I feel like I'm gonna always be like struggling to survive. Okay, it's the symbolic meaning of the dream. Okay, so now what are some of the sleep disorders we talked about?
Narcolepsy.
Narcolepsy. What's narcolepsy?
You fall asleep a lot.
Yep,
during the
uncontrollable
day.
falling asleep,
Yeah.
where you enter very quickly into REM sleep. So in narcolepsy, if you remember, you'll experience what's called a cataplexy. So that's where you basically instantly fall asleep and lose muscle tone and resistance, because the part of the brain that says shut down muscles activates and you go into REM sleep, right? What's another sleep disorder? Sleep apnea. So, and then insomnia is the other one. So insomnia is difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep. Sleep apnea is where you wake up frequently because you stop breathing. Okay, and then lastly, I'm not even going to talk about this just to kind of save time, but if you look in the book, there's a table that identifies categories of drugs and names of drugs. If you study that table, that'll give you what you need to know for the most part about the drugs section, okay? So it'll say like, they'll give you a list of drugs and then say what they do, and then you have to match it to the category, okay? So if it were to say false sensations, ecstasy, and LSD, what would you say?
Hallucinogens.
Hallucinogens. Yep. Okay, so that leads us to number 5, or chapter number 5, which is all about learning. So there's 3 parts to that chapter: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning. Let's start with social learning. Social learning is basically learning through experience with people. So social learning involves a lot of what's called modeling, especially. So if, like, for example, if I'm a person that you look up to and you want to be like me, I would be your what?
Role model.
Role model. So you see how that relates to modeling? Model in that instance doesn't mean like somebody that's going to be in a magazine or something. It means somebody that you copy your behavior after. Okay, so let's talk about classical and operant conditioning. Basically, you have to identify for classical conditioning what's the NS, UCS, CS, UCR, and CR. So what's the NS stand for?
Neutral stimulus.
Neutral stimulus?
Yeah.
How about UCS?
Unconditioned stimulus.
Unconditioned stimulus. How about CS?
Conditioned stimulus.
Conditioned stimulus. And then UCR and CR would be unconditioned response or conditioned response. So let's use a taste aversion as an example, right? A taste aversion is where you don't like the food anymore, and it's not because of the food itself, it's because you got sick for some reason the same time as you ate the food, right? So you pair, let's say it's coffee again, with getting sick and throwing up. You then start to associate the coffee with the nasty feeling of having the flu. Prior to conditioning, what would the coffee be? Prior to conditioning, what would the coffee be? Neutral stimulus. Yeah. Prior to conditioning, what would the flu virus be?
Your unconditioned stimulus?
Unconditioned stimulus. So after conditioning, what's the unconditioned stimulus? After conditioning, what's the unconditioned stimulus?
Feeling sick?
Well, feeling is the response, right? It's the same as before conditioning. Unconditioned stimulus doesn't change.
Okay.
I get the flu virus, assuming my immune system doesn't fight it off, right? Do I have to be conditioned to get sick? No, I'm just going to get sick. Then let's say I am conditioned, and again, I haven't had a vaccine or my immune system doesn't fight it off. I'm still going to get sick after conditioning, right? So the unconditioned stimulus doesn't change. So in this scenario, again, the neutral stimulus would be the coffee. The unconditioned stimulus would be the flu virus. After conditioning, the neutral stimulus, if conditioning works, always becomes what?
The conditioned stimulus?
A conditioned stimulus. And then the conditioned response is feeling sick as a result of the coffee. If you feel sick because of the flu virus, what is it? What's it called if you feel sick because of the flu virus?
Unconditioned response?
Unconditioned response, yeah. So be able to identify those in a variety of different scenarios, okay? So that's an example of classical conditioning. Remember I talked about the ABCs of behavior? A is antecedents, those are things that come before behavior. So you got the A and the B in classical conditioning. In operant conditioning, it's the B and the C, the behavior and then the consequence. So in operant conditioning, the consequences are called reinforcement or what's the other one? Punishment. And then those can be either positive or negative. This is the main thing people mix up with positive and negative is they think like morals. But remember the analogy I told you was to think like math, right? If you add something, it's positive. If you take something away, it's negative. And then if that thing that you added or took away makes it more likely that the behavior will continue in the future, what is it? Reinforcement. If it makes it less likely that it will continue in the future, then it's punishment, right? So let me give you a couple examples. I want you to tell me what it is. Let's say that I pick the person that has the most notes here, most detailed notes, and then I buy you a McFlurry or whatever. Assuming you like McFlurries, what would that be?
Positive reinforcement.
Positive reinforcement, because I've encouraged you to take detailed notes in the future, right? And I've added something to you that you don't have. So since I added something that's positive, and since it makes it more likely that you'll take detailed notes, it's reinforcement. Let's say that if you didn't pay attention, I made you buy me a McFlurry. What would that be?
Is it negative punishment?
What do you say?
Negative punishment?
What did you say? Well, if you really enjoy spending money on me, you have to ask the question, what was the behavior you engaged in immediately prior to? So immediately prior to that, you did not take good notes.
Yeah.
So I want to decrease the likelihood that you'll engage in the behavior of not taking good notes, right? So I make you buy something for me.
So I'm losing
I've taken money away from you, right? And I made it less likely that you'll repeat the behavior of not paying attention and not taking good notes. So because of that, it's negative punishment. Because I took something away from you, I took money away from you. And then next time, you'll do something different. Okay? Can you identify those if you're given scenarios?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go to chapter 6 then. What's chapter 6 about?
Memory?
I was going to say, who can remember what chapter 6 is about? Yeah, memory. So remember I had you do the activity in class where we drew out, either on the board or on paper, different processes in memory and different stages in memory, right? What are the 3 processes of memory called?
Long term, short term.
That's stages.
Okay.
What are the 3 processes of memory? Encoding, storage, and retrieval.
Yeah.
So encoding is getting the information into your memory. Storage is taking it out and making it useful. Or excuse me, storage is where it just sits there. And retrieval is taking it out and making it useful, right? Flip the page down here so I don't show the camera. If I showed the camera, people would pause right on there and then write everything down, right?
Yeah.
So again, encoding, storage, and retrieval. We also talked about the stages of memory. You have, what's the first one?
Short, or sensory.
Sensory. Then short term and then long term, right? Sensory memory has two types. Well, more types than this, but two main ones, right? What are the two main types of sensory memory? Visual and sound based, right? What's visual?
Stuff you see.
What's it called though? You said it. Iconic, yep. And what is auditory called?
Echoic.
Echoic. What's the duration for sensory memory unless it's processed?
Isn't it like 30 seconds or something?
No, that's working memory. That's short-term
Oh.
memory. No, it's
It's like 15.
no, it's like
10?
a second or two.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So then that leads us to the second stage of memory, which is short-term or working memory. That's about 30 seconds. If you remember from one of the experiments we did, we're able to keep about 7 things in our short-term memory. Average person, sometimes greater, sometimes less, depending on what it is and who the person is. Then the last type of memory is long-term memory. And if you remember, that can be divided into different types. You have what's called implicit memory. One type of implicit memory would be procedural memory. Give me an example of procedural memory.
How to ride a bike.
Riding a bike. Okay, everybody snap your fingers right now, right? Okay, there you go. Okay, didn't take a lot to pull that out, right? So that's procedural memory. If I ask my son to snap his fingers, can you do that? It's like, not 3 yet. My daughter probably can't do that yet either. So, and then conditioned responses are another form of implicit memory. Now, explicit memory can be divided into types also. What's declarative memory? Give some examples of that.
Isn't that like defining a word or something?
It's what?
Defining a word.
Yeah, word definitions, facts, stuff like that. Yep. Okay, we also talked about retrieval cues and different ways to help with encoding memories. So if you repeat something over and over and over again to remember it, what's that called? Maintenance rehearsal. What if you use analogies or come up with examples or create meaning out of it? What's that called? Elaborative rehearsal. So basically engaging in elaborative rehearsal gives you more retrieval cues. Those are things that help you remember something. So let's say like I'm thinking of a state, okay? So I tell you it's a state, I've narrowed it down to like 50 things, right? So that's a retrieval cue. Then I say the state starts with an A, and it's really far north, and it's the biggest state, okay? And I'm like giving you different cues. It's Alaska, right? So see what I mean? So those are all examples of retrieval cues. And it doesn't even have to be something that's related to the state necessarily. Like you could think of a movie, like that's not even in Alaska, but for some reason it reminds you of Alaska because you went on a vacation to Alaska and you like watched it while you were there, right? So that's still a retrieval cue. What is retrieval where you have a bunch of retrieval cues called? Like the Alaska example I just gave. What type of retrieval is that?
Is that elaborative?
Oh, that's rehearsal.
Oh.
That's a different concept. That's called recognition. What is it where you remember something without a lot of retrieval cues? Recall. Okay, that leads us to chapter 7, which is the one we're on now, which is on thinking, cognition in general.
Do you need another page?
So,
Do you need another page?
That should be fine.
we talked about intelligence. What's the most common measure of intelligence? IQ tests. Yeah. So how do you calculate an IQ test then? Other way around. Yeah. So we take like a 10-year-old kid and we give them a bunch of tasks that a bunch of average 10-year-olds could do. And if they do them all, then we'll give them something that a bunch of 11-year-olds could do, and then 12-year-olds, and then 13-year-olds. Well, let's say they get to 13 and they can do all that, but they can't go any higher, right? So we'd take 13 divided by 10, which would give us 1.3, times 100, which would give us an IQ of 130, right? So anything over 100 is smarter than average. Anything lower than 100 is below average intelligence. Now, different theorists have different ideas about intelligence. Probably the most dominant one is Howard Gardner. He initially had 8 theories of intelligence, and he added a 9th one. If you remember, he had logical, mathematical, visual, spatial, musical, movement or kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, naturalistic, existential, and verbal linguistic. Those are the 9 different ones. So the 2 main ones that people mix up are inter and intrapersonal. Interpersonal is the ability to understand and relate to people. So in the last review session, I gave an example of a person that's in each building on staff that I think is really good at relating to a variety of people. At Cheyenne, I would say Mrs. Riley or Miss Riley, the counselor. She just gets along with a lot of people fairly well, from what I've seen. And at West Fargo High School, I would say the principal, Mr. Sampson. So the guy with the beard, the bigger guy. So he used to coach football, used to student teach with me, and then used to teach social studies in our department. So interpersonal is understanding other people. What's intrapersonal?
With yourself?
Understanding yourself. So I gave the same example that I'll give you now in the previous review session, which was my kid, when it's time to eat, my son especially, low intrapersonal intelligence. What do you want? Pop-Tart. Okay, I open the cabinets. He's like, no, I want a bar. And I start pulling the bar out. No, I want Pop-Tarts. I said, you just said you wanted a bar. I put it back, and then he's like, no, I want some Lucky Charms. Yeah. So it's like the cover that has all the cereal stuff in it, right? Can't make up his mind. He'll put it on his plate and he gets mad and he wants something that he didn't get, right? So in one way he has low intrapersonal intelligence. So understanding yourself is intrapersonal. Existential is understanding deep questions about life, like purpose in life, meaning, existence, kind of religious and philosophical intelligence. And then naturalistic is understanding animals. Okay, we also talked about units of thought. One unit of thought is a mental image. So if I ask you to picture what your house looks like or what your car looks like or whatever, you can kind of get a visual for what it looks like, right? So that image in your mind is a mental image. We also talked about broad categories that include a variety of different things. What's that called? A unit of thought. Like vehicles, for example.
Oh, yeah.
That's a concept. And then what's the prime example of a concept that you think of called? That's a prototype. So I think in class I use the example of athletes. So athlete would be a concept. And then in different countries, or even for different people, they're going to have different prototypes, right? So I say think of an athlete. You probably think soccer player, you probably think runner or wrestler, right? Okay, so that's your prototype, but the concept of athlete is similar, right? We also talked about methods of problem solving. What is the one where you just try whatever you can think of until you get it right?
Trial and error.
Trial and error. What is the one where you follow like a formula? Step 1, do this, step 2, do this, and it's guaranteed to get the right answer.
Oh, that's
Algorithm.
Algorithm.
Yeah.
Yep. What's it called if you follow a rule of thumb strategy to complete the solution? A heuristic.
Heuristic.
Yep. So there's a variety of different heuristics. Some of them, well, they're not guaranteed to give you a solution, right? But they'll work generally. So let's say, for example, I said, okay, somebody in here is like here eating right now is a retired veteran, right? And I don't know this, I'm just making up an example, right? So first person to find them gets $20, right? Okay. Are you gonna go to older people or younger people first?
Older.
Probably older first, right? Okay. Are you gonna go to guys or girls first?
Guys.
Probably guys first, right? Now it could be like a 25-year-old girl that's veteran, right? So you might get the answer wrong, but it's a way that you can narrow down your guesses, right? So in that instance, you'd be applying both what's called the availability heuristic and the representativeness heuristic. Because you're using information that you have that's available, and then you're also picking people that represent categories. It's a little louder in here than I remember. You agree or not?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. That's pretty much it. Pretty much it in a nutshell. Any questions about anything? Go ahead.
Like everybody on the same day?
Yep. Yep.
How long does that have to be? Or like, just
Intro, body, conclusion. Not super long. The matching goes quick. It's literally 2 sheets of paper in front of you. So I try to condense the words and make it pretty obvious. So psychodynamic, you see, developed by Freud, focuses on the unconscious. Like that's literally what maybe not like literally, but it's like that short, right? So it's pretty quick. So like
Yeah.
so psychodynamic's going to be on there because I just told you. Here's literally what it says, right? Freud focuses on unconscious mind, early experiences, and motivations. So it's not like it's multiple choice where you have to read through a whole bunch of answers. It's like, if you know what the answer is, how long does that take you to answer that? 5 seconds? 10 seconds, right? So in past years, I'd say maybe in each class there's 1 or 2 people that have to stay after and I write a pass for. But most people finish on time. You'll stay until you're done and already get past your next class. Yeah. Anybody else?
So the essays are only on
You have to take something from the video and relate it to something that we talked about in class. So, for example, one of the essays is about the feats of memory that anybody can do. And if you remember from that video, he talked about ways of memorizing things that's more lasting, more long term. I'm trying to figure out how to explain this to you without telling you what the essay is, but in short, basically you have to relate the video to something we learned about memory. Okay? So
Do we have like 3 options?
yep, you have 3 options on each page and you pick 2. Each essay is worth 15 points. So the test is 70 questions, a point each. Is 100 points total. And each essay is 15 for 100. So generally what happens is people, I'd say the class average on the matching part is like 62 out of 70, like just under an 8 typically. I've used the same version of the test 4 years now probably. Subtle tweaks where I might not like the wording or something, but pretty much the same. Class average roughly is 62 out of 700 every time. The essays, people either get like 100 on, or like a 90 or higher, or they get like a 60 on. So if you missed a video, or like some days I'll see people that the video comes on and they have like an anatomy quiz and they're like cramming for that and not really watching the video. I'm like, you can do that if you want. The essay is going to be hard for you if you don't pay attention then. You know what I mean? So if you're worried about it, like I said, read through the questions that I posted online, and if you can kind of, if I was in your shoes, I probably would print that page off and like take a few notes on each question. Yeah, from the wiki. Yeah.
Are there like answers that we can see, or do we have to watch the video again to figure it out?
The links to the video are on there. Okay. What do you mean? Answers?
Like for your questions and stuff.
Yeah.
Are there other people that have tweeted in answers?
Yep. If people that were doing the extra credit tweeted the answers.
Okay.
Yep.
So like on the sheet, does it say like what the video is about, kind of, or is
Yeah.
it just like it says their name?
It doesn't say like. For chapter 2, we watched a video that addressed 3 clues to remembering, or 3 clues to understanding your brain. It like says in the TED Talk by V.S. Ramachandra, he mentioned 3 clues to understanding your brain. One of them has to do with a blending of the senses. What is this and how does it relate to something we talked about in chapter 2? Something, right? Okay. The answer for that one would be synesthesia. There's a variety of different directions you can take the other part in. Okay. Anybody else? So if I was in your shoes, especially because Friday, what do we do on Friday? Like
Review.
2 days review. What are we doing tomorrow? Reviewing. So if I were you, you came to the review session and you're reviewing in class, I wouldn't worry about this part too much. I'd focus most of your efforts on the essay. Unless you're sitting here now and you were totally confused, then I probably would study more of that, right? But if you generally were pretty good about what I just talked about, I would maybe reread through some of the notes you took a couple times, pay attention obviously in class tomorrow, but focus more of your independent study time on the essay.
Wait, how many points is the essay?
15 for each question. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. You want to push stop? Thank you. We'll see you guys tomorrow.